The Seventh Tower by Garth Nix. Book 1, The Fall. Chapter 12. They went a long way into the drift, so far that Tal seriously thought he'd be smothered before he could claw his way back to the surface. At least the Shadow Guard had let go of his sunstone, so he had some light and could tell which way was up. Or so he thought. Being buried in the drift was a bit like being underwater. The cold, wet snow was all around him and kept getting in his mouth and nose every time he tried to breathe. The only way to move was to use a half-swimming, half-digging action. Fortunately, the sunstone warmed him and lit his path. When Tal finally clambered out of the drift and staggered to a point where he was only up to his waist in snow, he held the sunstone up and concentrated on it. It grew brighter, and waves of warm air flowed from it over Tal's hands and sopping wet clothes. Tal groaned and grimaced as the warm air returned feeling to his frozen hands and face. Tal stood there for what seemed like hours with the warm air flowing around him, as much as he could generate from the sunstone. But he still couldn't get really warm. His shadow guard was draped across his shoulders like an extra cloak, but it didn't help. Even worse than the cold was his sense of disorientation. There was nothing but snow around him, as far as his sunstone's light fell. There were no other lights in the darkness. It was a completely alien landscape, even stranger to Tal than the spirit world of Einir. At least he had been there before, and was trained to cope with it. He also knew how to leave Einir. What if he was trapped in this cold wasteland forever? The warmth of his sunstone helped Tal think a little. It was familiar and comforting, even if it did melt the snow around his legs and make them wetter as the rest of him got dry. "I have to get back to the castle," said Tal. Saying it aloud made it seem more likely that he would. On his shoulder, the shadow guard made itself ahead, and nodded in agreement. Saying it was easier than doing it, Tal thought as he looked around. The sunstone illuminated a small area around him, but even 10 stretches away, it was dark again. There was no sign of that other light he'd seen from above. "Which way is the castle?" he asked, hoping his shadow guard would know. It shuffled on his shoulder, and then extruded a thin, one-fingered arm that pointed off at a right angle. "That way," said Tal. It looked the same as any other way. "How far?" The shadow guard did not answer, but he felt it made a motion like a shrug. Tal thought about the question for a moment, then rephrased it. He was used to working at communication with the shadow guard. He often had to ask the same question several different ways. "How far to the castle in stretches?" asked Tal. Distances inside the castle were measured in stretches. Tal knew his arm from one shoulder to wrist was almost exactly one stretch. They didn't need a larger measure. The shadow guard extended a hand and grew 10 or 12 fingers, which it wiggled up and down too quickly to count. "A long way," Tal translated. He knew it had to be, but he'd somehow hoped it wasn't. "Well, I guess I'd better start walking." Following the direction the shadow guard had given, he started to push through the snow. It was hard work, harder than he'd expected. The snow was tightly packed, and though the envelope of warm air around him melted it a little, it was not enough to make walking easier. After a few hundred stretches of this, Tal was exhausted. He'd started to sneeze, too, and could feel fluid spreading in his chest, making it harder to breathe. Back in the castle, he would simply have gone to his parents, who could heal such simple ailments with their sunstones. But Tal had not yet learned healing, and so could only suffer. But he wouldn't give up. Far away, his mother lay ill in her bed. And what had happened to Gref? What if the spirit shadow that had taken Gref was like the one that had attacked Tal above the veil? Gref could be dead, or lying wounded somewhere. Tal had to get back as soon as he could. After a while, the snow got shallower, and while it was easier to walk through, Tal started to slip more often. He realized he was walking on ice, under a light dusting of snow. 1, 2, 3. He started counting steps. Somewhere around 1,000, he lost track of what he was up to and had to start again. His shadow guard was also having to point out the right direction every few minutes, as Tal started to turn into a circle. Everything looked the same. Ice and more ice, with nothing to see. He was up to 1,098 steps when he suddenly realized that while he was still counting aloud, his legs had stopped moving. In fact, he had fallen over in the snow, too weary to immediately realize what was going on. The Shadow Guard was tugging at him, hissing, trying to lever him back up again. Tal laughed at its efforts, a hysterical laugh that surprised him, because what was happening was the exact opposite of funny. But he did get up, and staggered on a few steps, his laughter turning into a choking cough. Then he saw the light. A strange, soft green light that was moving over the ice faster than he could run. For a moment he thought it was two enormous green eyes in the head of a huge monster, sprinting toward him. Then, as it drew closer and slowed, he saw that the light was coming from a box that was being drawn across the ice, in harness, by 6 shaggy-haired, 4-legged creatures with tall heads and spiky branches sticking out between what he presumed were ears. The box was some sort of cart, Tal realized, like the ones the Underfolk used to move things around. But it had very long, thin sort of feet things, Tal guessed, instead of wheels. The soft green light came from the globes that were mounted on either side of the strange cart. They were made of tightly woven strips of bone, with the light coming through the gaps in the weave. Then Tal noticed that there was someone in the contraption. For a second he felt incredible relief. It had to be some of the Underfolk. He'd never really understood where they got all the food and goods used by the Chosen. Obviously they came out here to get something. He would commandeer their strange transport and have them take him back to the castle immediately. "Thank the light!" he gasped, staggering forward, holding up his sunstone, ready to show light and prove himself a Chosen. The next thing he knew, he was face down on the ice, with his Shadow Guard wrapped around his knees, just as a spear whistled through the air exactly where his head had been.